Hello, everybody. I gather we're in very different time zones in different parts of the world. It's 7 a.m. or thereabouts in Sydney at the moment, and I hope nobody's, participating in the middle of the night or early hours of the day. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm presenting this workshop on land that belongs to the Indigenous people of Australia. Where I am, it's the land of the Camaragal people of the Eora Nation. I'd like to pay my respect to the elders, past, present, and emerging, to their knowledge, traditions, and struggles of these traditional owners. Their land was never ceded and never will be. I feel very honored to be asked to present this workshop to members and friends of ALM. Of course, it would have been much nicer to be able to work with you in person, but I congratulate Judy, Beth, Charlotte, and the whole team for putting this event together. I think it's so very important to have this kind of opportunity during these very difficult times to get together and not lose the sense of community that is so important to all of us. So thank you again for the invitation. So the ALM conference that had been planned for July had the theme of adults learning mathematics in a changing world. I'm sure the organizers hadn't anticipated the kind of change that we have all experienced in the last 11 months or so, but it is the changing environment, though not specifically to do with COVID, that I want to focus my presentation today. I'll be inviting you to consider with me the question of how some of the profound changes that people have been experiencing globally are creating new demands and opportunities for adult numeracy development in their local context. In research that looks at numeracy as a social practice, we focus on the local context of the numeracy practice. However, these local contexts are constantly changing in response to reaction or in response to or reactions to changes around them. So I'll be considering ways of examining the nature and dynamics of these contexts of numeracy practices. Let me first explain what I mean by numeracy as social practice. The picture on the left is the cover of a book that was initiated by Brian Street, who sadly passed away before the book was completed. Many of you may know the work of Brian Street, his work on literacy as social practice, but Brian was also interested in numeracy and encouraged the adult educator Alan Rogers, the maths educator Cara Jackson, and I to work with him in putting this collection together. And the book is a collection of studies from around the world looking at numeracy as social practice. And by this, I mean the doing of and doing with mathematics in social practices. It may be workplace practices, it may be, everyday practices in the home and the community. It may also be, school and formal educational practices as well. And the studies illustrated how the numeracy practices are all dependent, contingent on the specific context of practice. The purpose, the tools that are used, the way the practices are valued, the power relations involved in these practices. And the studies in the book are informed by a range of theoretical resources, new literacy studies, ethnomathematics, cultural historical activity theory, situated cognition theory, but they all share a common concern for paying close attention to the context of the practice. So the message, or one of the messages from the book, is that the numeracy practices and the context in which these practices take place are inseparable. But when Kara Jackson, Alan Rogers, and I reflected on the different studies in our book, one of the interesting observations we made was that while context is always acknowledged as paramount in the study of numeracy practices, we don't always pay close enough attention to these, to how these contexts themselves can be unstable and fluid and changing. And I'm sure all of us can think of situations where demands and opportunities for revising and adjusting our numeracy practices emerge when, for example, there are changes to the composition of the people involved in these numeracy practices. So this might be a bit parochial, but if I can just give an example from my own experience, I know that every time there's a change in the head of the faculty in my university, the way that our workload is measured changes. Every new dean has their own bright idea of what constitutes a good workload formula. And so they bring in these new formulae, and the way that our work is measured and valued changes overnight. And we all have to adjust how we do our work and how we prioritize our work so we don't get targeted as being under load. So we all adjust our numeracy practices to make sure that we have adequate workload. And, you know, we don't do this without a fight, I might add, but the extent of the success of our fight is variable. But there can be other influences on the context of our numeracy practices that create a need or impetus for change, some of which I will discuss now. So interrogating the nature and dynamics of the context of numeracy practices seemed a necessary and, you know, very interesting next line of inquiry, which, you know, our colleague Jeff Evans and David Mallows had already been thinking about. So with Brian Crease, Jeff, David, and I published our initial conceptualization of what we called the Numerate Environment in the ALM journal in 2017. And the Numerate Environment borrows the notion of the literate environment, which had been developed and examined earlier. And the Numerate Environment, or this concept, involves three aspects of the context of numeracy practices. And these are the demands that the practices may make on the adults, the opportunities that the practices may offer to the adults engaged in these practices, and also the supports, resources offered, or conversely, the barriers existing or put up within the practices and cultures more generally that may impede the adult numerate development. So in this presentation, I'm going to be drawing on the idea of numeracy as social practice and this idea of the numerate environment in order to examine the context of these practices, and also how the context may be unstable or changing. So to give an example, this is an example of technological changes in a numerate environment. This is an example from a workplace research that I was involved in, where we looked at the literacy and numeracy practices of workers who were designing personalized hearing aids using a sophisticated or certainly what appeared to me to be very sophisticated, computer graphics software. So what we see here in the photo is a worker designing the outer shell of the hearing aid using a scanned three-dimensional image of the client's ear canal. And using this, the worker decides the dimensions of the shell, taking into account the spatial requirements for accommodating the different electronic components that need to fit into this shell. So they rotate the image, they drag icons of the electronic components into the ear canal to estimate how large, how long this shell has to be. And this was, when we did this research, this new computer graphics tool was relatively new to them. Because until then, the workers had been designing and essentially manufacturing, producing these shells manually. They would have a solid impression of the ear canal, and they'd have a little knife or whatever to essentially carve out that impression and make sure that it's large enough to fit the electronic components in. In this case, where there was the shift, technological shift in the work that these workers were doing, the workers said that the new demands created by the technology wasn't experienced by them as a major challenge, because they saw a continuity from their historical practices, doing it manually, into doing it by software. They already had a feel for what these hearing aid shells needed to look at. And so what looked to me like very complex and sophisticated work, to them apparently was not so. They said, oh, it's just like playing a video game, they said. But these workers experienced another shift in their numerate environment, workplace environment. And this was not so much driven by new technology. It was a new ethos, ideological change in the way work was to be done. So the company introduced what's called lean production or high performance production, which is essentially about doing more for less. Workers were divided into specialized teams. Each team had to come up with performance targets to measure their productivity and to track it on a daily, weekly, and monthly basis, displaying how they were traveling on various graphs that they produced. Graphs about, how many hearing aids they produced, how many faults there were, how many people were absent in a day, how many people arrived late. They were measuring and counting everything and displaying this on graphs. For many of the workers, this new way of working created new and unfamiliar numeracy demands. Many of them were not familiar with, using Excel, counting the kinds of things they had to count and measure. But the company did provide opportunities for these workers to learn how to do this. So working in teams, they took turns, they helped each other to do the counting, to record it in the Excel spreadsheet, and to produce a graph from it, and they would update the graph on a daily basis. So these are a couple of examples from my workplace research. Another example, not in a company workplace, but changes in the numerate environment created by climate change. This is an example from a study conducted by my PhD student, Roviro Chineka, in Zimbabwe. She was undertaking field work to study the informal learning of the people in the village to adapt to climate change. And here the climate change impacted in terms of disturbing the predictable and reliable rainfall patterns, so that planting according to the traditional calendar for planting and harvesting no longer worked. There was crop failure caused by drought, leading to serious food insecurity. They had to, give up their traditional diet and start to grow and change their staple crop. And it also impacted on the traditional roles in the different households because of the roles that, for example, the male head of the household took was, assumed by other members of the family who were more willing to take on different approaches to horticulture. And not being able to rely on the traditional planting calendar, villagers had to improvise to compensate for the lack of rainfall. And this included building an irrigation pump using available materials in the community. So climate change was something that is seriously impacting on this community, and people constantly having to improvise because their traditional ways of tracking when to plant, how much rainfall they can expect has gone out the window. So both the shifts to lean production in the hearing aid company and the disturbance to traditional horticultural practices in the village in Zimbabwe are examples where changes occurring in the global sphere have impacted on local practices, disturbing the context of the people's everyday work practices. In the first example, the change, though not new but increasing in its reach, is the dominance of neoliberal ideologies. The second is the increasing impact of climate change and global warming. Neither of these influences, however, can be controlled or effectively mitigated by local responses alone, because they are global phenomena. They might be examples of what some have called runaway objects, forces that transcend the boundaries between the history of specific activities or the history of a singular society and the history of humankind. They are profound changes with profound impact. So just focusing on some of the impact of neoliberalism, which has penetrated a wide range of social, political, and aspects of economic life. And one area is the nature of employment and the rise of precarious, insecure employment. And this has been, influenced by the neoliberal ideal of increasing privatization of public services and the global sourcing of the cheapest workforce, decline in trade union power and membership density, which then limits the collective power to challenge declining workplace conditions. Labor laws that are increasingly hostile to workers. So there's loss in job security, increase in precarious employment, and certainly in Australia, there's been a rise in what we call wage theft, that is underpayment of workers' wages that effect that has been affecting young workers and migrant workers disproportionately. So I'd like you to consider with me how this rise in precarious employment, precarious forms of employment, may be transforming the numerate environment of these workers. That is, what new demands and opportunities for numeracy development are presented to adults who find themselves in a constant state of insecurity of employment, where they have minimal workplace entitlements and protections, they have no paid leave, they have little voice in the workplace, they have little control of their work conditions. They're not able to get home loans because they have no secure flow of income. And it's impossible for them to plan for the longer term, often impossible to plan even for the short term. And they become easy targets for wage theft. So how are the demands for knowledge about money, financial planning for the short and longer term compare to the demands presented to some of us in more fortunate positions of more secure employment? Numeracy, along with literacy, ICT skills, and soft skills, is certainly in Australia acknowledged as a core component in many job seeker literacy and numeracy programs. But what are the social practices that precariously employed workers need to negotiate in their work? So these are unsalaried workers so unlike salaried workers with regular hours, leave, and other entitlements, workers on casual, precarious contracts need to themselves keep track of how many hours they need to work to make ends meet, how many hours they're working with penalty, overtime rates, what are the impacts of their finances on taking a day off when they are sick. Because in Australia, casual workers don't get paid sick leave. For them, work availability, days and hours of work, and their employment status may be different from week to week, and they may have casual work in a number of different places. Workers doing night shifts, for example, or working in isolation from other workers, are unsure about their workplace rights, can be subjected to wage theft, and they have little access to other workers to, if you like, compare notes, to learn from each other. So what numeracy demands does this kind of situation pose? And what supports are available to these workers? So using the framework of the numerate environment, we might say that the demands may include understanding of, their rate of pay, when penalty and overtime applies. Are there minimum or maximum hours of work per shift or per week? Do they have any entitlement to any allowances? Are they entitled to employer contribution to workers' superannuation for their retirement? These may be some of the demands that these kind of environment poses for workers on precarious employment contracts. In terms of opportunities for them to develop the numeracy to negotiate these demands, maybe there are opportunities for informal learning and opportunities to question their workplace rights with fellow workers. maybe there are opportunities for them to take, and I would imagine it would have to be collective action against instances of wage theft. But these opportunities would depend on these workers having support, including, being able to meet with other workers, having representation by a trade union or some other representative body. I don't know what that would be, but many of these workplaces have been completely de-unionized. So where do they go for this kind of support? Turning to another kind of force, global force that's impacting on our environment, our physical environment, is of course climate change. And the photo on the left is from the bushfires that we experienced south of Sydney at the end of last year. And we also know that there have been devastating fires across the west coast of the United States and other regions as well. And in many parts of the world, people are experiencing the impact of climate change in terms of extreme temperatures, more frequent and severe bushfires, or perhaps in some places, severe snowstorms, extreme drought, and also extreme flooding. Threat to air quality. The photo on the left is a picture of the Sydney Opera House last summer, covered in haze. We were all immersed in haze. And, there were invisible and hazardous particles in the air. And while there was the haze, we could see and feel the hazardous air quality. But we learned that even when the haze lifted, there were still these invisible particles in the air. And so we had to learn to look up this table in the bottom of the slide to check the air quality. And some days, the air quality, even though it looked clear, was still hazardous. Fortunately, the air quality is color-coded, so it's easy to find what the status is. But, we're no longer just checking the temperature or the ultraviolet indicators. We now have to check air quality to make sure that we're not walking into a health hazardous situation when we step out of our door. So again, what numeracy demands are presented by climate change to people in different parts of the world, and what supports are there for people to negotiate these demands. So considering, excuse me, a climate change affected area, which is probably most places in the world, as a numerate environment, we might say that there are demands for understanding, for example, what sources of reliable information are there about the weather patterns? How do we need to interpret indicators of air quality, weather patterns, ultraviolet radiation? What makes, what are critical or hazardous levels of air quality or rainfall or heat? What are the opportunities people have to make sense of all of this? Again, maybe there are informal learning opportunities with local community members who are experiencing the impact in similar ways. Are there supports? Are there barriers? And in the study by Rivero in Zimbabwe, she found that one of the barriers for adaptation in the community that she did her field work was the kind of habits or custom and practice of the community, where the elders in the community insisted that no, planting happens in the first week of October. And this is the crop that we plant because, this crop is our cultural identity. And they continued to insist that these, the changes in the rainfall were just kind of accidental. Next year, we'll be back to the normal pattern. So these were barriers to people wanting to, think differently and to say, no, we can't just rely on what we used to do because we've had so many seasons of crop failure and suffering from hunger because, we didn't have the food source. So power relations in the local community, who do we pay attention to? The elders, because, they are the senior members of the community, or do we start to listen to, like the children in the school who are learning about some of the science of climate change and alternative measures that they could take? But then the power relations might inhibit that from taking place. Maybe there are informal education programs, maybe social media, information from social media. Maybe there are expert advisors. Maybe there are apps on the phone that track relevant indicators. Okay, so what I've tried to talk about is how the rise of the precarious, insecure workers, and the impact of the changing weather patterns are phenomena that are felt and experienced locally, but they are aspects of global neoliberal trends and climate change. There are, aspects of a global phenomenon. And neoliberal ideologies and climate change affect people globally, but the impacts are felt differently, and the impacts are not distributed equally. Vulnerable people and communities experience the impact more severely than those with, greater means and privilege. So for example, in Australia, wage theft has disproportionately affected young people and migrant workers. And of course, these will have intergenerational effects. And I think, you'd also be aware that many countries experiencing the threat of food insecurity, dangerously rising sea levels, are not always the countries that are the largest producers of carbon emissions and contributors to climate change. So, these global forces are increasing levels of inequalities. So what I'm going to invite you to discuss in your breakout rooms, or suggestions for what you might discuss. I've got two sets of questions. So the first is focused on what I talked about, the neoliberal trends. Maybe you can consider the neoliberal trends in your social, political, and economic context, and think about how these trends are placing new demands on people's numeracy practices, and if there are opportunities, supports, or barriers for people to develop their numeracy to address some of these demands. And how can this analysis of the numerate environment inform adult numeracy educational practice? So is this framework of the numerate environment helpful in informing what we do as educators? Or you might want to focus on the climate change phenomena and how climate change is affecting the lives of people and other species where you are, and what new numeracy demands are created as a result of these climate change phenomena, what opportunities, supports, or barriers present themselves, and again, can this notion of the numerate environment help us as educators think about what we need to be doing to support adults to negotiate the demands presented to them. So I think I'll stop now. Thank you very much. I hope I haven't taken up too much of the time. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Keiko. That was lovely. And I really loved that framework that you presented and the distinction between the local and global contexts that really work together and inform each other. It's like a co-action.